Alrighty, hello everybody. We are back to do yet another poetry breakdown, analysis reading combo. This one is from the newest book of mine called I Don't Really Feel Human. And this poem is called I Can Only Be Perfect for So Long. It stretches across 2 pages in the actual book itself, and I broke it up into 2 parts in a sense here, mostly so it can just fit on 1 page. But there is kind of a part 1 and a part 2 within the poem itself. So I'm going to read the poem for us, and then we will start breaking it down. So, I can only be perfect for so long. You are rocks, just a pile of stones, sometimes different sizes, shapes, and densities. But I ask you please to think about where this toppled cairn of yours does lie, in what of which world. Imagine now your assemblage of jagged spheres. Do they rest on sunny moss, or are they tumbling and knocking down a river stream? Are they on some $1,000 palm pedestal, lights flashing? Or are they astride, side by side, a windy, facing cliff? Perhaps deep down among the upturned cobblestones, or in the alleys of perpetually smoggy streets. Don't let your rocky shores erode in some dark and questionable silence. Determine first where they are before you set to work identifying stones themselves. The artists would say hunger feeds the brainstorm, but this must certainly be in part because drugs hit you harder when you're empty. Smoke fills you faster, liquor twists you quicker. But once the state of states can be squeezed out, distilled after and before the waves, in that narrow, surging tidal space, the mind's eye of the storm, Paradiso is exposed, and whale hunters rush to net and spear to capture what they can before the seas return. So just in reading it very kind of quickly and briefly, we have kind of 2 major concepts that are actually repeated kind of frequently throughout this book, of pretty much just the rock and the water. I've found these 2 symbols to be obviously very eternal symbols, but in their lifelessness or lack thereof, we can kind of start to break down and analyze people and things in these kind of 2 very particular elements. And you might suspect or kind of expect the extension of like earth, water, wind, and fire as being the 4 kind of major elements. And to me, the rock and the water are very much so the bodily elements that tend to compose what we are and who we are. And most people, I think, affiliate the fire and the air with that internal quality, the soulness of somebody. If you've got the rock to be the structural component, and then the water being the element that connects the rocks, the blood, the literal water in our bodies and of the bodies of people we know, fire and air tend to be the more ephemeral substances that compose the soul and the mind. But I think you can basically do almost everything with just the rock and the water themselves. And so to use rocks as the structural component, the very first line and series of lines just being, you are rocks. It's just kind of a silly line on its face in that it's so short. It seems negative. Yet again, something that I kind of want to do is remind and reveal to people that the simple things are easily manipulatable to be negative or positive. And if you want to look at them negatively, if you want to look at a rock as something boring or stupid or pointless, you can. I think there's a reasonable argument to say that rocks are those things, but especially when you get into things like geology and gemstones and stuff like that, rocks become so much more interesting. And what they do and how old they are and what they really truly are and compose and create the world of is super interesting. But you are rocks, just a pile of stones, sometimes different sizes, shapes, and densities. This is just going to be the standardizing method that we're going to reduce everybody to just a pile of stones. There are tons of different stones, different sizes, shapes, and densities. You could come up with a perfectly unique pile of stones for every single person in the world. There are enough stones to do that. There are enough combinations of different things to arrive at sort of a signifier, a signifying system of something extremely simple to stand for someone or something. And I think once you reduce down to the basic elements like this, fantastically, I mean, for just functionally for this purpose, it just gets easier to work with. And so if we can reduce everyone to stone, comparisons become more fluid, ironically, and just give you a sharper kind of mental image. And that mental image is what I then ask the reader to please think about. Where this toppled cairn of yours does lie, in what of which a world. So you might have your own vision of stoneliness in your head for what you might want your pile of stones to look like, but I actually kind of jump past this in that I think, as I will kind of to cut down towards the end of the first section here, determine first where they are, where the rocks are, before you set to work identifying stones themselves. And so we'll get to that when we get there, but I argue, in a sense, that the more important part about what your stones look like is instead where they are. Do they rest on sunny moss? Are they tumbling and knocking down a river stream? Are they on $1,000 palm pedestal? Palm pedestal in this case being kind of a joke for the $1,000 Apple desktop pedestal or something like that. It was some ridiculously overpriced meme of the second for a completely ridiculous expense for something so replaceable with a lesser costed thing, but just for the clout, and people, I'm sure people bought it. But where your stones are, where does the sentiment that is you exist in the world? Either mentally, emotionally, physically. Are you on sunny moss? Are your jagged spheres, are they assembled on an open field with nobody around? Is that kind of the mental or emotional state of what you are and where you are? Or is that where you want to be? Is that your fantasy? Is that your goal? Is that where you were and now you aren't anymore? But the overall metaphor being this sense of you can create or have these hopeful places or sentiments or realistic places or sentiments of where you are, where you want to be. And that environment shapes so much of what the rocks are doing, or how beautiful the rocks are, where the rocks will be, and what you want them to be. But context being the environment shapes the rocks themselves. And so this being a metaphor both for environmental shaping and tectonic seismic shifting of the world. I mean, rocks are really what move and shake so many sliding pieces of this universe. And so if you convert people into these rocks and the environments that people are in, whether beautiful or not, in the perpetually smoggy streets or in the upturned cobblestones, kind of it just asks or begs of the reader to convert themselves into this pile of stones, and then imagine kind of this converted space. Where is it? And what is it? And why is it there? And why do you think that you are on sunny moss? Why might you think that you're in perpetually smoggy streets? There's a mental comparison, again, like a mental, physical, emotional comparison, spiritual comparison to these environments that you are placed in or place yourself in, and how you respond to that and act on that is really important. And so it's just kind of, I love asking questions of people to consider themselves, and in funky, structurally minimalist ways like this, I think is just a fun experiment. But so to jump down to don't let your rocky shores erode. So don't let your rocky shores erode in some dark and questionable silence. So don't have no concept of where you are, of where you want to be. Everyone is somewhere. If you are rocks, rocks are categorically somewhere. They are something tangible, and so therefore they have a tangible position in the universe, just like you do. And so if you are to live your life without having an environmental concept of where your pile of stones sits, everything becomes so much harder. Knowing what the rocks are but not where they are almost defeats the purpose of the rock. And so if you are to discover, and I ask then to not let your rocky shores erode in some dark and questionable silence. Determine first where they are before you set to work identifying stones themselves. And this can kind of be applied to many different other concepts, but the idea of, understand the context, understand the meta game, understand the system that the pieces are operating in. Just knowing what the pieces do in almost anything is essentially meaningless without context of what they can do and will interact with, and other piles of stones that those stones might bump and grind against. Just knowing the stone itself isn't enough, is my argument. And so understand where those stones are and then analyze that question. And say, okay, ask this question of yourself. And I then go into ways of asking or kind of approaching, a reference to various artists and the stereotypes of artists of being like the struggling, the starving artist. But I always reference Salvador Dali and stuff like that, who talk about how this forced state of either suffering or lacking or wanting does produce these artistic drives or these manic or depressive episodes that tend to produce content. And I mean, it's an unfortunate stereotype that, I absolutely think that suffering does produce art and can produce art, and it's a dangerous road to go down, but pushing yourselves to the limits of things or even just separating yourself from normalcy can be a way to produce this art. But so the artist would say that hunger feeds the brainstorm, in part because drugs hit you harder when you're empty, both figuratively and literally, in that smoke fills you faster, liquor twists you quicker. You get high faster when you haven't eaten. You get drunk faster when you haven't eaten. The connection between art and artists and drugs is therefore also a perpetual one. And so this is kind of a half call out of artist culture, as well as this half leaning into the reality of it. But once the state of states can be squeezed out, the literal chemical states of solid and liquid, the state of states, kind of the ultimate state, the truth of the situation, once that can be squeezed out through kind of whatever means possible, distilled after and before the waves, in that narrow, surging tidal space, the mind's eye of the storm, the brainstorm, the mind's eye of the storm, rocks of your brain in the context of what you are as a person, in the context of where you are in life, in the context of where that life is in the universe. Paradiso is then exposed, even if it's through the subversive means of the artist, being that drugs and alcohol and hunger and manic episodes. The argument is still that truth is discovered, or some sense of truth is discovered. And I leave it with the whale hunters' rush to net and spear to capture what they can in the eye of the storm before the seas return. This kind of fantastic image of Paradiso has been exposed, a paradise of Dante's Inferno up in the stars of the mind's eye. In the middle of the hurricane, everything is clear. And that's where the hunters, the whale hunters, the kind of evil forces almost, but necessary forces. If they're hunting for food and sustenance, the whale hunters can't be blamed on a certain level. and they rush to net and spear to take advantage of a situation and capture and kill and hunt what they can in that temporary truth before the seas return and the storm kind of retakes things and the sea retakes itself and truth kind of gets lost again for a moment. I wanted to create this overarching vision of starting with the rocks, the jagged spheres on sunny moss that transitions all the way over into these whale hunters attacking perhaps paradise in your own mind's eye. This predatory instinct of ourselves to try to hunt the truth within ourselves. It can be incredibly difficult, but a mandatory, necessary, I would argue, venture. And in that venture, no matter how malicious or not, the hope is that some senses of truth, some state of states can be learned so that you can then understand the context that you're in and where you are and where your stones are in the universe. And then you can start to understand what you really are in those spaces. So thanks so much, guys, again for hanging out, listening. There are all sorts of little tricks and plays on words in it itself, but I wanted to talk about the greater macro concept before, and I'm not even going to go into the little details there. But so thanks again. We'll create another one of these, I'm sure, once I get some requests from people, and have a good night.